Long before the first riflemen climbed down a cargo net and stepped into a landing craft, long before the thunder of naval guns echoed across the horizon, every amphibious invasion of the Second World War began in a place almost no one saw and even fewer understood. It began in the dark, silent waters offshore, where mines waited beneath the surface like sleeping predators. These mines did not roar or warn or reveal themselves until it was too late. They sat in the depths, tethered by thin cables, listening for the sounds of engines, feeling for the magnetic pull of steel hulls, waiting for pressure waves that signaled a ship had drawn close. And in the moment they sensed what they wanted, they exploded with a violence capable of tearing open the hull of a landing craft or sinking a warship built from thousands of tons of steel. This was the battlefield that lay hidden beneath every invasion beach from Europe to the Pacific. No map fully captured it. No aerial photographs showed the threat, and yet it was a battlefield just as lethal as any fortified bunker or machine gun nest. At Sicily, Salerno, Normandy, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the first battle was not fought by infantry or tanks or aircraft. It was fought by small ships that slipped into the darkness hours before the main fleet arrived. They were the minesweepers, the AN-class net layers and auxiliary sweepers, whose job was to open a safe path through fields of explosives deliberately placed to annihilate any approaching invasion force. The Allies learned early that the Axis understood the power of underwater mines. German engineers refined contact mines that detonated when struck by a ship's hull. They created magnetic mines that exploded when a large metal vessel passed nearby. They developed acoustic mines triggered by the specific frequencies of ship engines. They even built pressure mines that activated based on the displacement waves of heavy ships. These devices were scattered across likely landing beaches, laid in harbors, hidden in channels, and even dropped from aircraft into shipping lanes. A single well-placed mine could cripple a landing. A field of mines could stop one entirely. The same was true in the Pacific. Japanese defenses relied not only on bunkers and artillery, but on underwater mines arranged like teeth in a giant steel jaw. Approaching an island such as Saipan or Okinawa meant entering a zone where one wrong turn could erase a landing craft full of Marines or send a transport ship filled with tanks to the bottom. Unlike machine guns or artillery, mines offered no warning. A soldier on the deck never knew the danger until the water rose in front of him or fire tore through the hull. For commanders planning invasions, mines were nightmares made real. They threatened everything from the smallest Higgins boat to the largest battleship. This was why minesweepers were essential. Before the first wave of infantry could land, the waters had to be cleared. Before the first LST could lower its ramp, safe channels had to be carved. Before the guns of cruisers and destroyers could approach the shore to support the landing, the sea itself had to be disarmed. The men who performed this work did it at the most dangerous moment of every invasion. They sailed ahead of the fleet, often under cover of darkness, always within reach of enemy guns, towing cables and sweep gear through waters that could erupt beneath them without warning. AN-class vessels were small. They lacked armor. Their engines were loud. Their decks sat close to the waterline. They carried the most exposed men in the entire operation, yet they were tasked with the most critical job. Their steel cables dragged through the water, snagging mine mooring lines. When the sweep gear caught a mine, a sharp vibration traveled down the cable into the hull. The crew felt it instantly. They tightened their grips, bracing for what came next. Cutting blades on the cable severed the mine from its anchor, sending it bobbing to the surface. Then the minesweepers opened fire with rifles or machine guns to detonate it from a safe distance. The explosion sent a column of water into the night sky. It also signaled to every enemy gun onshore exactly where the sweepers were. Despite that danger, they continued their work. They had to. If they failed, the landing craft behind them would pay the price. The officers in charge of the invasions knew this. General Omar Bradley, who commanded American forces at Normandy, later said that the minesweepers had already won half the battle before the first riflemen stepped onto the beach. He meant it literally. If the minesweepers did not succeed, the landing would collapse before it began. Normandy was the clearest example. On the night before D-Day, minesweeping flotillas entered the English Channel ahead of the invasion fleet. The seas were rough. The wind howled. Many sailors were nauseous before reaching the halfway point, but the mission had to continue. Their job was to clear 10 separate approach channels miles long, each of them filled with German mines. They worked hour after hour, often in complete blackout, knowing that the slightest miscalculation could destroy their ship. When dawn finally approached, the minesweepers were still at work. They finished barely in time for the first wave of landing craft to pass through the cleared corridors. Without these channels, thousands of soldiers would have sailed directly into fields of underwater explosives. The same pattern played out everywhere. In Sicily and Salerno, sweepers risked coastal batteries firing directly at them. In the Philippines, they faced not only mines, but also kamikaze aircraft plunging toward their small decks. In the Pacific Islands, they swept so close to shore that they could hear enemy voices and gunfire. Many sweepers were hit. Some were sunk. Yet the survivors pressed forward because the entire invasion depended on their pathfinding. Part 1 ends with the image of a small AN-class ship moving through a dark sea, towing its cables beneath the water while explosions erupt in distant flashes. Behind it, hidden by the night, waits an armada of larger ships counting on a narrow corridor through danger that only these small sweepers can create. The ocean may look calm to those who will cross it later, but at this moment it is a battlefield. And the first battle has already begun, fought not by infantry or armored divisions, but by a handful of little ships that must win their war before anyone else can even start theirs.
To most soldiers, sailors, and Marines who served in the Second World War, the AN-class ships looked like nothing more than small utility vessels. They lacked the towering superstructures of destroyers. They did not carry the heavy guns of cruisers. They were dwarfed beside the hulking shapes of battleships and carriers. Even the LSTs and transports they escorted were several times their size. Yet these little ships, often overlooked in photographs and forgotten in official reports, carried a burden heavier than many warships 10 times their displacement. They were the first to approach hostile shores and the last to turn away. They were the thin line between a successful landing and a massacre. Without them, no invasion fleet could survive the approach to a fortified beach. The AN-class, originally designed as net layers and auxiliary minesweepers, had shallow drafts and compact hulls, which allowed them to maneuver in coastal waters where larger ships would run aground or become easy targets. Their crews knew every inch of the equipment strapped across their decks. They could deploy heavy steel cables, paravanes, and mechanical cutters with astonishing speed. Their mission was simple to describe, but deadly to perform. They sailed through waters believed to be filled with mines, dragged cutting gear behind them, and severed the mooring cables that held the mines below. Once the mines floated to the surface, the crew detonated them with rifle fire or small arms. These men stood on exposed decks with no armor shielding them, watching the dark surface for the faint shadow of a rising mine. They fired at point-blank range, trusting that they would strike it before the mine drifted too close. If they missed, the blast might break their hull in half. When crews of larger ships watched these displays from afar, many admitted later that they were witnessing some of the bravest work in the entire war. The design of the AN class made courage mandatory. The ships were not built to take punishment. Their thin hulls vibrated with every wave. Their engines rattled and strained. Their decks were cluttered with sweep gear that shifted dangerously during violent maneuvers. A single shell, a single mortar round, even a burst of machine gun fire could kill men instantly. Yet these ships were ordered to sail ahead of the fleet, often under direct observation from enemy coastal defenses. When the AN class approached a hostile shore, their crews listened for the sounds of distant surf breaking against sand. That sound meant they were close to the mines. They worked quickly, deploying paravanes from each side of the ship. The sweeping cables cut through the water at an angle, forming a narrow corridor behind them. The gear vibrated when it snagged a mine. The sailors felt that vibration in their hands and feet. It was the signal that death had been touched, that some explosive device meant for a larger ship had now been dislodged. Every crew member knew what came next. A floating mine would bob to the surface. Men would lean over the rails with rifles or light machine guns. Then, with composed precision built from countless hours of training, they opened fire. The mine exploded in a plume of water and spray. The shockwave shook the entire vessel. Men caught their balance and turned back to their stations. There was no time to admire the explosion. There were always more mines waiting ahead. What made the job even more perilous was the knowledge that the enemy watched them at every moment. German and Japanese defenses often positioned observation posts specifically to track minesweepers. Coastal gun batteries waited for the sweepers to reveal their path before opening fire. By identifying the cleared channels, defenders knew exactly where the invasion fleet would pass. Sweepers were not only removing mines, they were unintentionally marking the route for enemy gunners. This made them priority targets. The crews understood the risk, yet they pressed on because their sacrifice meant safety for thousands. Each cleared channel allowed LCVPs, LSTs, and transports to move forward. Each destroyed mine meant another landing craft would reach the beach instead of vanishing in a sudden blast. The AN class did not exist to draw glory. Their purpose was to protect those who followed. In both theaters of war, their tasks were remarkably similar, even though the threats varied. In Europe, German mines guarded fortified coasts from Normandy to the Bay of Biscay. These mines were sometimes arranged in multiple rows, each one intended to disable a different type of ship. Smaller mines targeted landing craft. Larger ones waited for destroyers or transports. Magnetic mines threatened any steel hull of significant size. Acoustic mines activated when they detected the hum of heavy engines. Minesweepers had to neutralize all of them. They used magnetic sweep coils to trigger the magnetic devices. They deployed acoustic sweepers to imitate engine noise and detonate the sound-activated ones at a safe distance. In the Pacific, Japanese minefields were less technologically complex, but often far more numerous. They were hidden close to shore, sometimes just beyond surf lines, making it impossible for larger ships to pass. Many were designed to blow the hull off small landing craft and drown entire platoons before they reached the sand. Minesweepers in the Pacific frequently worked close enough to shore that they could hear enemy shouts and see muzzle flashes. Their work was done under direct fire, but the alternative was allowing invading troops to be slaughtered before they could even form a line. Every man on an AN-class ship knew that the operation depended on him. If they failed to clear a minefield, then LSTs carrying tanks would be destroyed. LCVPs filled with riflemen would disappear in fragmented bursts of water and steel. Battleships and heavy cruisers providing fire support would be forced to stay back, leaving assault troops exposed. In every amphibious operation, the minesweepers carried the first responsibility. Everyone else followed their path. Part 2 ends with the image of an AN-class ship drifting in early morning light, its crew soaked from spray, its rifles still warm, its cables cut and reeled back in. Behind it, the distant shapes of the invasion fleet appear on the horizon. They follow a narrow corridor through the sea, a corridor carved by the courage of men whose names few will ever know. Before the rifles of the first assault troops fire, before the first landing craft touches sand, the little ships have already made the impossible possible. In the final hours before the sun rose on June 6, 1944, while hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited aboard transports and landing craft, another battle was already raging in the darkness of the English Channel. It was not a battle of rifles or artillery. It was a battle of steel cables dragging through black water, of unseen threats scraping along the hulls of tiny ships, of sailors gripping their stations while explosions erupted in the night. Long before the world heard the name Omaha or Utah, the men of the minesweeping flotillas had begun the first fight of D-Day. The mission required precision that bordered on the impossible. The entire invasion depended on the creation of 10 narrow approach lanes through German minefields stretching across the Channel. These corridors would guide more than 5,000 ships toward the beaches. If the sweepers failed to cut even a single critical path, landing craft would drift into mine belts and die in clusters. If they misjudged their timeline, the assault waves would arrive too early or too late, disorganized and vulnerable. And if they failed entirely, Operation Overlord would collapse before the first soldiers set foot on French soil. Just after midnight, as the invasion armada prepared to depart British ports, the minesweepers moved ahead at slow speed. Their decks were dark. Their engines growled against the wind. The men stood at their stations, hands wrapped around rails slick with spray. The sea churned under them with long rolling waves. Many were afraid the weather would ruin everything. High seas could snap cables, capsize paravanes, or mask the presence of floating mines. Yet the order came, firm and undeniable. Proceed. German defenses along the Normandy coast were prepared for surface ships, aircraft, and landing craft, but their first line of protection lay beneath the waves. Dozens of minefields blocked the approaches. Some held simple contact mines, each one capable of ripping apart a steel hull. Others contained magnetic or acoustic mines designed for larger ships. The Germans believed these belts would shatter any invasion force foolish enough to push into them. They did not expect small minesweepers to enter the minefields under cover of night and open the gates. The AN-class and other auxiliary sweepers moved into formation. Each ship deployed its sweep gear, unspooling steel cables that cut through the waves behind them. These cables dragged paravanes designed to catch mine mooring lines and sever them. The moment a mooring line snapped, the mine rose toward the surface like a deadly buoy. Sailors scanned the dark water for the faint silhouette of a sphere rising beneath the foam. When the first mine broke the surface, a warning shout echoed across the deck. The crew swung their rifles and machine guns toward the floating shape. A burst of gunfire crackled through the dark. The mine exploded in a towering column of spray. The shockwave rattled the little ship, lifting the bow and slamming it back into the sea. Men grabbed railings to keep from falling. Then, without pause, they searched for the next one. This pattern repeated again and again as the sweepers carved their channels toward the French coast. The wind pummeled them, waves crashed over the bow, mines rose and detonated in brilliant flashes that illuminated the night like lightning. From the cliffs of Normandy, German observers saw the distant bursts and filed reports that enemy vessels were probing the mine belts. They did not yet understand how close the invasion was. The sweepers pushed on. Every minute mattered. Behind them, the invasion armada crawled across the Channel in near total darkness. Tens of thousands of soldiers huddled inside LSTs and transports, unaware that their fate rested in the hands of a few hundred men sailing ahead of them in fragile ships barely larger than fishing trawlers. The sweepers knew the responsibility. Many had trained for months knowing that a single mistake could doom thousands. At 3 in the morning, the sea grew rougher. Some ships strained to maintain formation. Others fought to keep their sweep gear from tearing loose. The captains gave orders in hushed tones, adjusting headings by degrees.
Every movement risked snagging a mine or losing the corridor entirely. Yet the little ships held their line. Their discipline created the lanes countless vessels would follow in the hours to come. As the coast grew nearer, the threat increased. German coastal guns came within range. At any moment, searchlights could sweep across the water and reveal the sweepers. But luck and darkness stayed with them. Their greatest enemy remained the mines themselves. The sweepers cut dozens, then scores, then hundreds. Some mines drifted too close before they could be destroyed. Others exploded underwater, sending shockwaves through the hull that made the men fear the next one would break the ship in half. By the time the sky grew faint with the first hints of dawn, the minesweepers were finishing their final approach lanes. Behind them, the invasion fleet was advancing in immense columns, following the cleared paths like trains on invisible rails. The sweepers signaled completion. Command ships confirmed. The channels were open. Only then did many of the sweepers turn away, exhausted and trembling, their decks littered with spent cartridges and frayed cables. The officers aboard the command ships understood what had been achieved. The infantry had not yet landed. The battleships had not yet opened fire. The landing craft had not yet crawled through the surf. But the first half of the battle, the half no one ever saw, had already been won. General Omar Bradley would later say that the minesweepers were the heroes of D-Day. He meant that without them, his soldiers would have died before they ever reached Omaha or Utah. The little ships had moved through the darkness, touched the minefields, and survived. They had cleared the gates for the greatest invasion in history. Part 3 ends with the sight of dawn rising behind the retreating minesweepers. Their wakes fade across the channel. Ahead of them, the immense shapes of the invasion fleet surged toward France. The rifles have not yet fired. The landing craft had not yet hit the surf. But the path is open because a handful of little ships carved it with courage in the dark. While Europe witnessed the minesweepers' silent heroism in the cold waters of the English Channel, the Pacific offered a different, more brutal stage. In the vast island chain stretching from the Gilberts to Okinawa, the little AN-class ships confronted a world where the sea itself seemed hostile, where reefs, hidden shoals, and violent surf combined with deadly Japanese minefields to form a gauntlet no fleet could breach without them. If Normandy demanded precision and nerve, the Pacific demanded raw courage in the face of direct fire. Japanese commanders understood that American amphibious warfare depended on timing. Landing waves had to arrive in perfect sequence. Heavy fire support ships needed clear approach lanes to position themselves. LSTs and LCVPs had to cross shallow reefs without hesitation. To break this system, the Japanese laid mines close to shore, often so near to their defensive lines that sweepers had to operate within range of machine guns, mortars, and concealed artillery. The minefields were not designed to stop destroyers or cruisers. They were configured to obliterate landing craft. One explosion beneath a Higgins boat could kill an entire platoon in seconds. This reality greeted the minesweepers at every major island assault. The first to feel it were the crews off Tarawa in late 1943. Japanese engineers had planted mines in the lagoon and along the outer approaches. The water was shallow and treacherous, riddled with coral that tore in hulls. Yet the sweepers advanced, dragging cables that often snagged against coral heads instead of mines. Men leaned over the rails, squinting into the pale light of dawn, trying to distinguish a shadow of death from the shadow of a rock. On several of the passes, Japanese shore guns opened fire. Shells splashed around the little ships, sending geysers of water across their decks. Still they pressed on. They had to. The landing craft behind them had no other path. As the Pacific campaign marched westward, the mines became more numerous and more clever. At the Marshalls, some were concealed beneath drifting seaweed. At the Marianas, mines were placed near breaks in the coral reef, the only natural entry points for amphibious craft. The sweepers had to inch toward these narrow gaps while heavy Japanese guns watched every move. Sailors recalled the sickening feeling of hearing enemy rounds whistle overhead while their ship crawled forward, unable to maneuver quickly because the sweeping gear trailing behind them demanded precise alignment. On Saipan, the minesweepers worked so close to shore that Marines watching from transports could see the tracer fire streaking toward their decks. The sweepers returned fire only when absolutely necessary. Their mission was not to fight, but to clear. Every minute counted. Their cables dragged through waters churned by surf and gunfire. Mines rose to the surface in rapid succession. Some were destroyed before fully emerging. Others detonated unexpectedly, sending shock waves that stunned the men and rattled the entire ship. After the battle, many sailors said that sweeping the minefields off Saipan felt like stepping through a doorway that might explode each time they lifted a foot. Tinian offered a different challenge. The water surrounding the island appeared calm, but beneath it lay intricate fields of tethered mines, arranged deliberately to trap landing craft in a kill zone just offshore. The sweepers had no choice but to approach slowly, engines humming at low speed, steering by inches to avoid reefs, while the Japanese watched from concealed firing positions. The mines they cut loose bobbed to the surface, some drifting dangerously close. Men fired on them in hurried bursts, praying they had aimed true. The shock waves from the detonations rolled beneath the hull, and each time they did, the crew wondered if the next explosion would be too close. But nothing compared to Okinawa. There, the Japanese had transformed the surrounding waters into a maze of mines and anti-boat traps. Many mines were set in shallow water where sweeping gear was difficult to deploy. Others were deliberately placed under overhanging cliffs or near concealed gun emplacements. Some were surrounded by underwater obstacles meant to tear open the hulls of landing craft even if the mines failed. To clear these paths, minesweepers had to operate so near the shoreline that they could feel the heat of explosions from Japanese artillery. They threaded the edges of reefs, sometimes scraping the bottom with their keels. The water around them frothed with shell bursts. The sky burned with tracers. Yet the crews did not break formation. During the early days of the Okinawa campaign, one minesweeper found itself surrounded by 3 mines rising simultaneously on its port side. The men opened fire instantly, hitting 2. The third drifted closer than any sailor wanted. A burst from a Browning machine gun struck it just seconds before it contacted the hull. The explosion rocked the ship so violently that several men were thrown to the deck, yet the vessel continued its run. Behind it, the first wave of landing craft formed up. If that minesweeper had failed even once, the incoming Marines would have sailed directly into death. Throughout the Pacific, the minesweepers paid a terrible price. Many were sunk. Many more suffered heavy casualties. Survivors described the experience as fighting an enemy that never revealed itself, an enemy that waited in total silence and struck without warning. And if the mines did not get them, enemy fire often tried to finish the job. Japanese commanders understood that killing a minesweeper could disrupt an entire landing sequence. They targeted these small ships with a ferocity normally reserved for destroyers. Yet the sweepers endured, because withdrawal was never an option. If they retreated, the invasion would stall, and thousands of men waiting offshore would die, trapped in landing craft that had no clear path ahead. The sweepers' courage made the assaults possible. Their work gave LSTs the room they needed to drop their ramps. Their cleared lanes allowed LCVPs to surge toward the beaches. Their sacrifice let battleships and cruisers approach close enough to unleash their guns. Part 4 ends with the image of an AN-class ship limping out of the line, smoke rising from its stern, its deck scorched from near misses. Behind it, another sweeper takes its place in formation. There is no ceremony, no pause, no hesitation. The mission must continue. The Pacific demanded everything from these little ships, and still they gave more. because without them, the great island battles that defined the war would never have begun.
When the war finally ended and the world began to measure the cost of every battle, most histories focused on the heroism of infantry storming beaches, the thunder of battleships firing from offshore, and the dramatic scenes of landing craft racing toward sand under fire. But the men who had commanded those operations knew a quieter truth. They knew that none of those scenes could have happened without the work done hours earlier in the dark by ships so small that they rarely appeared in photographs or after-action reports. They knew that the first victory of every landing belonged not to the troops hitting the shore, but to the little ships that cleared the way. It was a victory earned quietly, invisibly, and often without witnesses. It was a victory won by men who understood that their mission would never be celebrated, yet carried it out with a sense of duty unmatched anywhere in the war. After the war, senior commanders spoke openly about the scale of what the minesweepers had achieved. General Omar Bradley said that the minesweepers had already won half the battle before the first riflemen stepped onto the beach. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the architect of many Pacific invasions, wrote that without minesweepers, no amphibious operation could succeed, no matter how many troops or ships were committed. And the British Admiralty, reflecting on Normandy, Salerno, and Sicily, wrote that the first men to fight in any landing were not soldiers, but sailors dragging cables through the darkness and exposing themselves to the full weight of enemy fire and hidden explosives. These statements revealed something that wartime censorship and battlefield focus had obscured. The minesweepers were not support units, they were the tip of the spear. They were the very first combatants in every amphibious assault from North Africa to Okinawa. Their victories happened before most men even knew the invasion had begun. While soldiers slept in the holds of transports or waited anxiously inside landing craft, the sweepers had already risked everything. As peace settled over the oceans they once fought across, the men of the AN class and other sweeping flotillas carried memories that few could understand. Many recalled the loneliness of their mission. Unlike infantry waves that landed together, minesweepers often operated in small groups or even single ships, separated from the main fleet to clear alternate channels. They sailed through black water where the only sound was the rumble of their engines and the hiss of cables dragging through the sea. Sometimes the only light came from the sudden fireball of a mine detonating, or the brief glow of tracer fire from shore. The weight of responsibility pressed on them every moment. They knew that thousands of men depended on their success. They understood that their mistake could bring catastrophe to those who followed. Some sailors described the emotional strain of knowing that no one else saw their part of the battle. When a mine detonated near a sweeper, the explosion might light up the sky for only a moment. Then darkness returned, and the rest of the fleet remained miles behind. When a sweeper came under fire, it often fought alone until it could slip back into the protective embrace of larger warships. And when a sweeper completed its mission, it usually did so without fanfare, turning quietly away as the invasion fleet advanced through the path it had carved. But among themselves, the sweepers held a different understanding. They knew what they had prevented. They knew that each mine they destroyed represented a landing craft that did not sink, a transport that did not vanish in a fireball, a battalion that did not drown before reaching the beach. They knew that every safe corridor was a lifeline, and they knew that their work saved lives on a scale no one would ever count in the newspapers. The records after the war made this plain. In operations where minesweepers performed effectively, amphibious casualties were dramatically lower. At Normandy, despite fierce resistance on the beaches, the fleet reached the coast intact because the minefields had been neutralized. In the Pacific, at Saipan and Tinian, landing craft advanced with minimal loss because the approaches had been swept. At Okinawa, despite enormous Japanese firepower, the landing waves arrived in order largely because sweepers had cleared a labyrinth of underwater traps. And across the Philippines, where Japanese minefields guarded every channel, minesweepers opened routes that kept entire divisions from perishing at sea.
But the sweepers themselves rarely spoke about these achievements. Many felt that their role was overshadowed by the dramatic stories of beach assaults and flag raising. Others believed that the true measure of their success was not in medals or recognition, but in the lives of the men who reached shore because the sea had become safe for them. Their heroism was quiet, practical, and rooted in a deep sense of responsibility to the soldiers and Marines who followed. Years later, historians studying wartime records discovered that the little ships had faced casualty rates far higher than many frontline units. Minesweepers were frequently targeted by shore guns because the enemy understood their importance. They suffered explosions, fires, sinkings, and relentless danger, but they continued anyway. Their mission did not allow retreat. If they turned back, the entire invasion force would be exposed. Part 5 closes with a simple but powerful image. A small AN-class ship moves slowly away from a hostile shore, its cables stowed, its decks scarred, its crew exhausted. Behind it, stretching across the horizon, an entire fleet advances through the safe passage it created. Landing craft drop ramps, infantry rush forward, tanks roll toward the beach, gunfire erupts across the coastline. The great battle everyone knows has begun, but none of it would have been possible without the small ship already fading into the distance, its victory won before the world even noticed the war had started that day. The little ships made every invasion possible. Their work was unseen, their sacrifice unheralded, but their impact shaped every decisive moment of the Allied war. They were the first to fight, the last to withdraw, and the reason thousands lived to tell the story.